So hello and thanks for joining us, and welcome to the National Adaptation Forum's virtual Climate Displacement Forum hosted by EcoAdapt. I'm Molly Johnson, one of the forum organizers and your moderator for today's webinar, Climate Displacement and Anti-Displacement Strategies. Before we get started, I just want to go over some housekeeping rules to ensure a successful webinar. So please, to reduce feedback, please place your telephone, cell phone, or computer on mute, even if you're using the voice over IP option. Please use the question function in your control panel to submit any questions to the presenters throughout the webinar. Please also use the question function to report any technical issues you might be encountering. We will be recording and posting this webinar on the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange for future viewing, and the webinar should be available online within the next week and can be viewed at cakex.org. Additionally, slides and presenter information is available for download in your Handouts tab. And finally, we have a cool new feature that we're starting with this displacement forum, and we'll be compiling recommended resources on climate displacement for all of the attendees and the larger adaptation community. So you can make suggestions to that resource page by following the link that my colleague Alex will share in the chat box. I'm really pleased to introduce our speakers for today's webinar. So we have Rachel Gregg, who's a senior scientist and cake content editor at EcoAdapt. We have Catherine Braddock, who is the associate scientist at EcoAdapt. We have Marissa Ramirez, the project manager for the Healthy People and Thriving Communities program at Natural Resources Defense Council. And Kirsten Cook, who is the Just Growth portfolio manager at Partnership for Southern Equity. Finally, we have Will Domine, who is the impact manager for housing affordability and equitable development at the Bay Area Health Inequities Initiative. You can learn more about each presenter by downloading the presenter information PDF in your Handouts tab. We would also like to quickly acknowledge that there are many people across the U.S. experiencing immediate threats to their lives and livelihoods due to climate change impacts and displacement. This series is intended to provide a holistic view on climate displacement, but cannot be representative of all the people and communities facing or working on this issue. We encourage you to share about your work and your experiences here today via the question function, as well as on our virtual networking platform. We also want to thank you for attending today despite all of the challenges and uncertainty due to the ongoing pandemic. With that said, let me pass it over to Marissa to get us started. Thanks, everyone.
Hey, thanks so much, Molly. Marissa Ramirez with the Natural Resources Defense Council, and I work on equitable and sustainable development with the SPARK initiative. I'll say more about SPARK shortly. I'm really excited to be here with all of you online and with my colleagues at Barhai, Partnership for Southern Equity, and you all at EcoAdapt. So I'm going to talk a little bit about SPARK and how climate displacement became a through line for our work and why we were interested in going deeper into the research on the topic. Just wanted to start out to share a little bit about a piece that my colleague Mary wrote. Her recent article in Rolling Stone captured this idea of converging crisis, noting that we no longer have the luxury of dealing with just one issue at a time anymore. And so as fires are burning in the West and hurricanes are continuing and ongoing racial unrest, looming presidential elections, unprecedented pandemic, it was both disheartening and yet somehow comforting to read this and sort of understand, to get someone that sort of understands this intersection. So I'm really glad that we have the space on this forum to talk about some of these intersections. And just starting off with a little bit about Spark. Spark is a strong, prosperous, and resilient communities challenge. And we can go to the next slide. We work with national partners, Enterprise and Lyft, and our local partners in Atlanta, Memphis, Chicago, Denver, Bay Area, and LA. Will and Kirsten are two of our partners, and we're working to influence policies and practices that shape our cities through intersection of racial equity, health, and climate change in the built environment. And so the issue of climate and displacement became a theme in the initiative, and as a result of this, we commissioned research with EcoAdapt on a survey of practitioners that you'll hear more about, as well as a sort of compendium literature review that our partners with the Urban Displacement Project at UC Berkeley wrote. And so the goal was really to provide a framework for others to start to make these connections between, creating resilience and long-term health and wealth. And across the country, we see sort of these historic development patterns that lead to segregation and disinvestment in displacement. And then this cycle of climate exacerbating this. For instance, we think about Chicago and repeated urban flooding in some neighborhoods. And then climate is also driving now where and how we live. And so we can think about Miami, where you have more affluent residents in some areas and low-lying areas impacted by sea level rise, moving to higher ground, putting pressure on some low-income, high-elevation areas. And this cycle continues if our development patterns are disconnected to transit or housing remains inefficient and greenhouse gases continue to increase. And so the result is this, and we can go to the next slide. Climate change can directly lead to displacement. So people have directly lost their homes in wildfires, for example. But displacement can also happen when there are green investments like parks or transit, and housing prices continue to rise or home insurance goes up. And so what this means is the very solutions that we're advocating for to protect us from climate change can also lead to displacement. And so our partners in Spark, some of them are working around the LA River revitalization, the 606 Greenway in Chicago, or the Beltline in Atlanta, and are facing these pressures locally around home and culture. And so we hosted a convening with Spark around the topic of investment without displacement, and climate displacement was a thread that intersected in the areas of the project. So the good news, and you'll hear more about this from our other speakers, but the research affirmed that displacement and gentrification aren't doomed to be a part of, a sad narrative of making our cities climate ready. And so, some of the key takeaways is just, climate change, displacement, and inequity are interconnected. And because of this, our approach to addressing those intersecting issues must span across sectors. And as practitioners, whether you're in climate or in development or housing, we have to think beyond how we measure success in terms of economic terms or greenhouse gases. And so the survey has shown that this is possible, and our partners have shown that this is, something that they're working on. And for instance, in LA, some of our partners are working on things like innovative financing for anti-displacement strategies that include community land trusts that, can focus on acquiring land that is both climate resilient and retains affordability for the long term. And I think, the survey also really was affirming and that, there's many strategies that are out there. And so now is this opportunity to really organize ourselves to elevate, implement, scale these pieces that you'll hear more about from our speakers. And I'll just end by saying, I think this conversation is really timely. And, because we've seen from the response to the pandemic, for example, that it's possible for us as ordinary people to make substantial change. And yet in addressing climate change, a vaccine isn't going to turn back time. The changes that we need to make as a society are going to be permanent. And so how can we use this time to learn? And I think the forum is a really great space for us to explore the broader vision for human development through the relationship between climate and people well-being. So thank you very much, and feel free to check out our website for more information.
Thanks, Marissa. I'm gonna head over to my slides. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining. I'm Rachel Gregg. So as Marissa mentioned, EcoAdapt was commissioned to run a survey. So we did an online survey and several interviews to try and learn more about the factors that influence community vulnerability to climate change, the risks that are associated with displacement for individuals, for households, and full communities, and then factors that drive the ability of communities to cope with both temporary and potentially permanent displacement of residents. So our goal in the survey, our goals for the survey included to identify strategies that may reduce the impacts of climate change and displacement, to try and assess the needs of practitioners, and to document examples from across the United States. Next slide. So as I designed the survey, we tried to identify ways in which climate change affects our communities, from limiting access to and availability of affordable housing and healthy food, to transportation, healthcare, and social networks, all the way to forcing displacement of individuals and communities. And as Marissa mentioned, displacement is an issue that's really rooted in inequity and exacerbated by climate change. And in some cases, the improvements that we're making to communities may actually lead to increased vulnerability to climate change. Next slide. So climate change is just one of several factors that influence the potential displacement of individuals and communities, and climate risks and impacts are not equitably or equally distributed across communities. So sea level rise and hurricanes obviously may drive displacement of coastal communities, while wildfires and flooding may disrupt communities more inland. Social determinants play a big role, so things such as economic stability and access to services influence a community's ability to prevent or recover from a disaster or climate-related event. And these social determinants are, of course, a factor for both displaced and receiving communities who may need to actually accommodate individuals and families that are displaced from their origin communities. Next slide. So the survey asked for some basic demographic information, as well as the level of concern about climate change and other key issues such as housing availability and cost of living. So we asked folks about what types of strategies can be considered to support anti-displacement efforts, what strategies can contribute to community resilience or which may be vulnerable to climate change, what information is used and what information is needed in order to make better decisions in a changing climate. Next slide. So just to provide some framing for the results, most of our respondents came from California, Washington, Illinois, and Florida. Our respondents primarily represented non-governmental or community organizations and city and county government officials, with over 50% of respondents from mid to large size communities. And we did have about 91% of participants agreeing that climate change is having or is likely to have a significant effect on their communities. And that's quite high for most of the other surveys we do in different sectors. Next slide. We asked if respondents had considered climate change in their efforts to address displacement, and 64% said yes. So of those taking action, they are primarily motivated by concerns of climate justice and equity, perceived threats to communities from climate events, their own personal motivation or general concern, and then also observed changes or a recent natural event such as storm or flooding. Next slide. So participants were also asked to identify specific barriers with respect to addressing displacement in a changing climate. And so the top two barriers noted by respondents who are both engaged in adaptation and those who are not currently engaged in adaptation are, no surprise, limited funding or lack of funding in the amount, but also the flexibility in the application of funding, and also staff capacity, staff resources to actually address climate change. Funding is constrained by the amount of money and then restrictions in the type of funding as well. So For example, most federal funding for natural disasters and extreme weather events is very reactionary and focused on recovery. So the slow onset of a lot of these climate-driven impacts is not really factored into funding programs to provide for that proactive pre-hazard mitigation efforts that a lot of communities would like to take on. And when we typically ask this question of other respondents in other sectors who are not currently taking action on climate change, the highest responses we usually get are uncertainty, scientific uncertainty in the projections or about what to do, stakeholder opposition, and actually a lack of specific climate data. So the fact that people in this survey who are addressing displacement in communities don't feel that those are of the highest concern is actually a good sign. Next slide. So some of the major themes that we saw from the survey, and the final report was released a couple of months ago, and Molly has a link to it in the chat, and it'll be on the resource page. The tension between temporary and permanent displacement. So if we can stay in place or can return post-event, a lot of the responses focused on how can we make our community more livable, more resilient to climate change and other stressors such as the availability of housing, the availability of access to critical resources. And then if displacement is unavoidable, where can we go? And how can we relocate without causing further physical, emotional, financial harm to the people who are moving? The second major theme was the carrying capacity of the receiving communities. So if that displacement is unavoidable, again, how can we relocate without causing further physical, emotional, financial harm to the people in the communities that are receiving those displaced from origin communities? And what might full-scale climate migration mean for the loss of culture, the increased pressure on natural resources, and then the policy and legal constraints between origin and receiving communities. And then finally, the survey was really useful in helping to identify opportunities to support communities and individuals. So using the results to determine what people need. And a lot of what came out of that was case study examples, the opportunity for learning exchanges, peer-to-peer, resident-to-resident learning exchanges, and technical assistance. A lot of times, some of the people who are displaced from either temporarily or permanently displaced from their houses because of a storm do not have the technical assistance to apply for the application to receive funding in order to be able to recover. So we're looking to try and fill some of those gaps and share these results as far as possible to make sure that others can step in and help fill those gaps as well. And I'm going to turn it over to Catherine to share some examples.
Great. Thanks, Rachel. So survey respondents were also asked to consider activities that may increase individual or community vulnerability. Some of the quotes from the respondents are here on the slide. These activities can look like trying to maintain a certain status quo in an area while baseline problems continue to exacerbate or contribute to community instability. So for example, low-income housing located near known sources of pollution or subjected to disturbances such as flooding. Additionally, limitations in resources, including access to critical services and economic or job opportunities, can amplify vulnerabilities as well. An example here would be disparities between where poor neighborhoods are located and where job opportunities may be accessible or available. Additionally, access to food, reliable transit, or medical care can also be lacking in this area. Maladaptive practices that can exacerbate vulnerability can include things like rebuilding or continuing to develop in high-risk flood zones or permitting development without accounting for climate impact. Next slide. Examples of anti-displacement activities that may help to increase resilience were also provided by respondents. So in terms of infrastructure and development, some of these activities may look like integrating climate change into design and retrofitting, incorporating climate change into equity and community land use planning as well. An example of this are the zoning ordinances recently enacted by the city of Norfolk and Virginia. So all new development must meet a certain resilience quotient. So the infrastructure is evaluated based on different resilience criteria that look for components such as decreasing flooding risks or increasing mobility, as well as encouraging development in low-risk areas. In terms of policy, activities that can increase resilience could be increasing sectoral planning and implementation, as well as incentivizing climate-informed development. An example of this are the anti-displacement avoidance policies that have been included in the grant administration of Los Angeles's Measure A. This is a parcel tax on the development of parks. Within the guidance for this manual for this measure, there are guidelines to avoid displacement, as well as scoring criteria for the applications that include factors such as potential displacement. Next slide. With regards to transportation and access, some activities that can help to increase resilience include incentivizing public transit use or expanding access to local food sources in food insecure neighborhoods. In Madison, Wisconsin, for example, the neighborhood of South Madison is in a food desert. So the Center for Resilient Cities, in partnership with the Badger Rock Neighborhood Center, are working to promote urban agriculture and community gardens as a way to boost local food supply. This capacity building in terms of increasing resilience in a community, examples like public education or engagement, workforce investment, technical or financial assistance can help to do that. A specific example would be the Be a Buddy campaign out of New York City's Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. The campaign encourages community members to check in on vulnerable neighbors, particularly during extreme weather events. This type of activity can kind of create a social cohesion in a community that can help within these extreme events. So the campaign is really helping the community to prepare for future climate impacts through public health and climate health education. Next slide. So products that have resulted from our survey and research include the overall synthesis report. In addition, we have 5 case studies that are the results of interviews that highlight anti-displacement activities in Los Angeles, the San Francisco Bay Area, and Atlanta. We also have a climate change in our community activity and coloring book. All of these resources are available on the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange, or CAKE, at cakex.org. So we are lucky enough to have 2 representatives from the organizations we did our case studies on here. So I will pass that on to them to hear more about their work.
Hi, my name is Kirsten Cook. I am with the Partnership for Southern Equity. Next slide. Our mission at the Partnership for Southern Equity, or PSE, is to advance policies and institutional actions that promote racial equity and shared prosperity. And our main focus is looking at development in metropolitan Atlanta, but we also have some work that is starting to expand to other parts of the American South. We work towards this mission through 4 primary issue areas, and those are shown right here, but essentially they are energy equity, equitable development, economic inclusion, and health equity, and we give each of those a title of just energy, just growth, just opportunity, and just health. In each of these, we also focus on organizing and leadership development, which I will discuss a little bit more as part of our theory of change. Next slide. For those who are not familiar with the Atlanta area, our climate change and displacement issues focus largely on flooding and extreme heat events. This is felt most strongly in disinvested neighborhoods, so resilient, weatherized, and quality infrastructure is a major focus. A few years ago, when Hurricane Irma hit, Atlanta faced a huge influx of climate migrants, when thousands fled South Florida and either stayed in Atlanta or drove through here. And unfortunately, we anticipate the climate migration that comes with these severe events to be commonplace in the coming years. Next slide. The work we do around climate change and displacement, as well as with all of our work, centers on our theory of change. We are driven to flip historical inequities to a forward-thinking future, and our community organization work is driven by the following beliefs. One is that residents directly impacted by inequitable policies must be positioned to lead decision-making at the beginning, middle, and end of a process. Secondly, that creating engagement opportunities is critical in shaping how the residents' public policies and practices will be influenced by the wisdom provided by leaders of impacted populations. And thirdly, due to vigorous engagement, new leaders, civic infrastructure, and policy innovations can be realized that support better outcomes. Next slide. Each of PSC's issue areas operates through what we call circles. The Just Growth Circle, which is focused on equitable development, is a network of diverse businesses, nonprofits, academics, and community members who are committed to furthering equitable development in the South. It's essentially a community of learning, practice, and innovation. And we come together with our members on the second Friday of every other month, which we have been doing virtually since March, to support each other in building our connections, capacity, and courage to realize a transition towards equitable development in the Atlanta region. And each of our circles has developed some shared values. And as you can see, these are written on the screen, but I just wanted to draw attention to the top left one first, which is that we anticipate and protect against displacement. And the description here is mostly focused on gentrification and development pressures, but we also are considering climate displacement and how that impacts vulnerable neighbors. And then the bottom right one, which is to heal environmental injustice, that we prioritize investment in communities that have felt the cost and burden of poor infrastructure in the past. Some of the examples that I will be talking about today are going to touch on that. Next slide. So ultimately, our circle model enables us to pre-build an equity ecosystem in order to act together in a way that influences moments of opportunity. And those moments of opportunity range in what they might be, but those are a few are listed right here, that they can be decisions about design, location, funding, hiring the projects, which happen really quickly. And so a lot of traditional development takes place without much community engagement because they do happen so quickly. But conversely, we know at PSC that change happens at the speed of trust. So in the Just Growth Circle, or the JGC, which I will be referring to as from here on out, we work towards cultivating these relationships so that when infrastructure or energy decisions arise in our region and need to be influenced at a moment's notice, we are better prepared to collaborate in a way that pushes for equity, as well as for health, a better carbon footprint, higher resilience, and sustainability. Next slide. So on this topic, I also wanted to uplift a current moment of opportunity that the JGC is rallying behind. The Atlanta Department of Watershed Management is proposing changes to the current stormwater ordinance. And the changes proposed would go a long way to addressing the flooding in neighborhoods like Peoplestown, Mechanicsville, and Summerhill. There's a picture here on the left of what flooding in those neighborhoods look like. And then these neighborhoods are also pointed out generally with this arrow in the map here, which has an overlay of historic redlining to demonstrate the disinvestment that's taken place in these areas and resulted in poor infrastructure. So unfortunately, there's a group of developers who are not in favor of the changes to the stormwater ordinance and have gone so far as to say that the changes would make it impossible to construct affordable housing, which actually is not true. Upfront construction costs may be higher, but as a local stewardship council points out, aggressive retention standards can result in savings through reduced operating and maintenance costs. Also, the city of Atlanta has high water rates that can be offset through reuse that's incentivized through the ordinance revisions. And moreover, not implementing these changes can increase insurance premiums, which disproportionately impacts vulnerable renters and homeowners in these neighborhoods. So as a result of pushback from developers, the department has withdrawn the important stormwater ordinance proposed changes, unfortunately. However, the JGC has been able to quickly seize this moment of opportunity because of our relationships with a number of equitable development partners who are leading the charge, and we've been able to help rally around this. So we still have yet to see how this will unfold, but we are hopeful. Next slide. And we're hopeful not only because of past successes on this front with the City of Atlanta, but also specifically with the Watershed Department in the city. So a few years ago, the U.S. Water Alliance selected Atlanta among 6 other cities to take part in a learning exchange called the Water Equity Task Force. The PSE joined with a few other community partners from the JGC, and we collaborated with the Atlanta Water Department to work together on a water equity roadmap to help guide some decisions for the future of the City of Atlanta. So as you can see in this table shown here, the roadmap addresses shared equitable water decision-making, workforce development, and climate resilience. And I'm just going to highlight one of the issues our task force worked on for the sake of time. First, some helpful context is that the City of Atlanta was selected as the first municipality across the country to launch green infrastructure or resilience projects using innovative environmental impact bond or EIB financing. So the Department of Watershed Management will use $13 million in bond financing to implement green infrastructure projects in both the combined and separate sewer areas of the Proctor Creek watershed, where, again, neighborhoods have been disproportionately impacted by flooding, combined sewer overflows, and environmental degradation, as well as unemployment. So many of the priority actions listed on the far right of this table relate to how the partners in the Water Equity Task Force came alongside the Department of Watershed Management to ensure that the steps taken to make the EIB work were equitable. So these green infrastructure projects are now anticipated to reduce flooding, improve water quality, restore and enhance wildlife habitat, create green space for recreation and education, promote local workforce development, and increase the resilience of communities. The projects are expected to reduce stormwater runoff by over 56 million gallons annually, and to provide local residents with training and jobs in green infrastructure construction and maintenance, which is very exciting. Next slide. So also relating back to the circle model diagram that I showed you, pre-building capacity is a core facet of our work. PSE currently has 3 types of academies that equip resident leaders in a greater understanding of racial equity and racial disparities as they relate to localized impacts on gentrification, transit, and energy and climate justice. In one of these academies, the Just Energy Academy, participants learn, among many other things, about how energy has evolved in order to establish community-determined best practices. And that's key, that they're community-determined, in order to mitigate local climate change impacts and to address evolving energy policies. Next slide. And finally, I wanted to share with you about the Equitable Development Implementation Tool, or EDIT, which essentially operationalizes the core values of the JGC, the 4 that I showed you in the slide previously, in all aspects of the development project. So EDIT covers every stage, starting from initial scope to planning and permitting, construction, final occupation and use, which enables developers to navigate equity considerations throughout, while simultaneously learning about and elevating accountability with the communities where they develop. And this slide just shows a screenshot of the preliminary tool that we've created, but we actually have a much bigger vision to build this out. To be completely candid, we currently lack the full capacity and funding to do so. But ultimately, we envision the tool working as a checklist and a resource for developers in Atlanta to do development more equitably from start to finish. Of course, we envision probably mission-driven developers being the first to use this tool, but we also hope to work with the city to eventually make this kind of tool a requirement for developers to utilize in order to make sure that communities are getting quality development that's equitable and resilient in the face of the climate impacts that we will continue to experience. But in the meantime, we are continuing to work on a number of other projects, and I really appreciate the opportunity to share a few of those with you today. So next slide, just to say thank you for your time.
Thanks, Kirsten. This is Will Dominy with BARHI, the Coalition of Health Departments in the Bay Area. Thanks for having me, everyone. So I wanted to start off by noticing the absolute urgency of this issue. So actually, if you could go back to that slide, the first slide, that's my friend's house that burned down a couple weeks ago in Santa Rosa, California, in the northern part of the Bay Area where we work. If you go to the next slide, that's my house at midday, and you can see, well, almost nothing because the ashfall from the fires made it like midnight during the day. And so I wanted to start with these two slides because I think we often, and sometimes I've fallen into thinking about climate change as something that happens, out into the future. And for many of us right now in California, and for folks in the South, and for folks all across the country and across the world, climate change is happening now, and it's happening very, very intensely. I'm actually, because of the co-occurring disasters of COVID and the fires and smoke and childcare, I left my home right now, and we're staying with family. And that's going really well for me, but for a lot of folks, there are a lot fewer options. And so just want to start with like a real sense of urgency about climate change and displacement. Next slide. So I work at BARHI, which is the Coalition of Public Health Departments in the Bay Area. And we were founded by the leadership of public health departments almost 2 decades ago, who realized that the health conditions that the residents of the Bay Area were facing were bigger than any one health department could face on their own. If you go to the next slide, one of the things that we've done within the public health field is really help popularize the idea that if we're serious about people's health, and if we're serious about closing inequities in health outcomes, we actually have to take actions that address the structural causes of those inequities. And so this is the BARHI framework. This is something we've introduced to the field, and it's now used in textbooks and agencies across the United States. And it's our guiding principle for the work that we do. And traditionally, health agencies have focused on the right-hand side of this, so thinking about the doctor's office, diseases and injuries, how we change people's health behaviors. We're the people that brought you seatbelts or contact tracing, things like that. But what we're trying to do is help shift the field of public health to think more about living conditions and how those influence health, and then ultimately how social inequities and institutional inequities shape our health outcomes. Next slide. So this is our COVID recovery platform, and COVID isn't climate change, but I wanted to show this slide just to note kind of the way that we think about issues. And our work on climate change and any kind of disaster or threats has really been influenced by the environmental justice and climate justice movement's concept of transformational resilience, which is that basically recognizing that there are long-term trends, long-term inequities that really shape communities' capacity to respond to any kind of threat, any kind of shock. And our task is both to be able to respond in the moment to threats and shocks, but also to really heal those long-term inequities and make sure when we bounce out of crisis and actually into something better that's more just. So for us, when we're thinking about COVID, for instance, we're not just aiming to get back to normal. We're actually, like, if you look at the fourth bucket, we're aiming to revolutionize the status quo to protect people of color and their health over the long haul. Next slide. So I'm going to talk today about 3 different cases of what that looks like in climate change. And the first one is around, essentially around power. And Kirsten already really, I think, focused a lot around community engagement. I'll just touch on that one briefly. The second one is around the North Bay fires. And then the third one is really around how we need to think about sequencing and tenant protections to get towards anti-displacement. So let's move into those cases. And so if you go to the next slide, the first, these are some of our partners from around the region on a project that we did supporting the Bay Conservation and Development Commission in the Bay Area on their Adapting to Rising Tides project, where they're aiming to think about how do we really protect communities from the threat of rising tides. And they asked for our support in helping to do that in a way that really centers the leadership and vision of communities, and in particular low-income communities of color. And so we helped them design a contracting process and then a community engagement process that was really co-produced alongside community-based organizations, and specifically these folks, so Roxana, Ophelia, Nahal, and Mariana, from two communities in East Palo Alto and then East Contra Costa County, designing a process that really built in community leadership and vision. And if you go to the next slide, we've got a quote from Roxana that I think is particularly on point, which is, if you want an inclusive process, essentially you need to pay for it and need to budget for it. And then if we're serious about building community vision and leadership, we need to be really investing in it. And that's investing monetarily, but also in terms of our time, our approaches, building the scopes of our projects alongside community-based organizations. If you go to the next slide, we're putting all the learnings from that project into a report, which will be released next month, called Farther Together, in which we detail 7 practices for engaging communities successfully. And I think the key thing that I want to pull out of that Adapting to Rising Tides and community engagement work is really anti-displacement is about power. It's about communities having the power and self-determination to shape their own futures, so that when shocks, when climate change impacts, when green investments happen, they really have the power to steer those in the direction that they need and meet community needs. Next slide. So the next case I want to talk about, this slide used to just read North Bay fires, and I'm starting to have to put dates on these slides because we're now having fires every year. But after the 2017 North Bay fires, which were some of the earliest really intensive fires that we saw, we worked with community-based organizations in the North Bay, and then our member health departments in the North Bay, to do a couple things. One, to help inform our members around equity principles and practices, and then also to really document what was working and what could be improved in terms of the recovery process and resilience process from those fires. Next slide. And I think something that circles back to my point around transformational resilience is that the trouble, like the displacement that happened after the North Bay fires and during the North Bay fires, most of it wasn't the result of the fires themselves. It was the result of many decades of housing crisis in the Bay Area. We were already at a point where Sonoma County had a 2% vacancy rate before the fires, where people were absolutely struggling, where many households were paying 30 or 50% of their income to stay in their home. And what we saw is after the fires, median rent jumped 35%, homelessness was up 11%. We saw a lot of homeowners who, maybe owned rental property and then were displaced from their homes, move back into their rental property, displacing the renters that lived there. We saw in particular homeowners, being able to access emergency money to be able to rebuild, and renters and especially undocumented folks just with absolutely no resources, and then facing extreme displacement pressures. Next slide. This is something I think that just typifies kind of the approach that we're aiming for, which is, we'll be back, and we'll be back better and stronger. Next slide. So some of the lessons that we pulled out of that, one was a real focus on immigrant justice and language justice, and making sure that there was targeted aid and programs for undocumented people. The county really got a lot of feedback especially from the immigrant community and others, and adopted an equity-centered recovery and resilience framework, which is really strong. They also passed some really strong tenant protection policies, and California kind of piloted the idea of anti-gouging laws during the disaster, and then those eventually evolved into the state now has a statewide rent cap. And then now organizers up there are pushing for stronger anti-eviction policy, especially during COVID, to make sure that people can stay in their home. Next slide. So the last case I want to mention is a case of green investments. And this is a project I worked on. It was one of the first projects I worked on in my professional career in the Monument neighborhood in Concord, California. It's a almost entirely immigrant Latinx neighborhood. And folks were fed up of not having a safe street, especially for their children to get to school. The area around the school was very unsafe. And so I worked with folks there. We did a community-based planning process, put in some bike lanes, a stop sign. We got millions of dollars of investment into that community. And here you can see some of the community members with the we did it, we won. And we did win. And it was only later that I was talking to a friend who lives in that neighborhood who said, well, we did it all wrong. We should have worked on the housing part first. And what they're now seeing is massive increases in housing prices, partly because of the work that we did to make that community nicer. If you go to the next slide. So we're now seeing data from the last 3 years, and this is a little bit dated at this point, but we saw as many formal eviction filings in that county as there are seats in the Concord Pavilion, which is our large entertainment venue. So if you look at all of those empty seats, those are eviction filings. And that's probably just a part of the total evictions that took place in that county. Next slide. And so I want to leave us just with some thinking about, what can we do? And there's two pieces from a policy perspective. One is just getting really solid on our tenant protections. During a COVID era, that's really focusing on eviction and foreclosure moratoria, and then rental and mortgage assistance and legal counsel for folks that are in danger of losing their homes. And then there's a whole range of other policies that we need to have in place at the local, regional, and state levels to protect families. And then longer term, we've got a framework around the three Ps of housing justice: protecting residents, preserving affordable housing, and housing that is affordable to people, and then producing housing over the long haul. Next slide. So just to sum it all up, one, we need to fund and support community leadership. So again, this is about power and making sure we're resourcing communities to have that kind of power. Two, it's about that idea of transformational resilience. So making sure that we're centering equity in every stage of the preparedness, response, and recovery process as we're facing disasters. Three, that we're thinking about protections, really strong tenant protections, and doing those before we make investments, before we make adaptation investments or other kinds of green investments. And then fourth, having a suite of broader policies around protections, preserving affordable housing and affordable communities, and then producing new affordable housing. Next slide. And that is it. Thanks for having me, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Will. And we'll get our other panelists online quickly. Molly, did you want to run that poll, or do you want to just jump straight in since it's already 11:50?
Let's do one poll question. Let's do the one focused on COVID. So I'll pull that up right now. So the question is, or it's more of a comment, and if you agree or disagree, but we need to do more to address the impact of COVID-19 on climate and displacement. And I'll just give you like 30 seconds to answer. And in the meantime, if you have any questions for the presenters that you haven't gotten to submit so far, please do so now. We'd love to hear from you and what you want to know further from them. All right, I'm going to close the poll. We had probably 60% of people respond, so thank you to those who were able to. And let's look at the results. So we had 78% of people agree that we need to do more to address COVID and climate and displacement. And then 9% were neutral and 12% were not sure. So I wonder if any of the presenters wanted to start off with elaborating on this question and seeing if there are any ways they see that we can connect COVID and climate and displacement. And then I'm handing it to you, Rachel, to continue with the Q&A. Thanks.
Anyone want to take that?
I would just say briefly that a lot of the communities that are facing these really severe impacts of climate and displacement are also facing the most severe impacts of COVID-19. And so recognizing the traumas that they have experienced historically and looking at what protections need to be in place. I know Will discussed some of the moratoria on foreclosures and evictions, and that's something that has been a huge issue in Atlanta, and I'm sure in many other cities across the country. So engaging with communities and recognizing the traumas that they're bringing into it, and particularly looking at policies that are going to protect them in their housing displacement.
Yeah, I will say what's been happening over the last couple of months does feel like a proxy for a lot of the conversations that we have with people about how climate change may affect them, physically, emotionally, financially, mentally, really just, getting through the day. And then being out in Seattle and with Will, we get about 2 months of sun in Seattle. And the last month was the red sky of wildfire, and we had to stay inside, and I had to get 2 different masks because the mask that worked for the pandemic doesn't work for the smoke. So you really have to have a couple of different adaptive options at your fingertips and diversify your choices. So some good lessons learned individually, but I think we will probably see some examples from how communities are dealing with the pandemic and the responses to that in terms of, putting a halt on some stormwater fees and utility fees and things like that. And we didn't need a pandemic to realize that there's a lot of things we could be doing better in our communities that I think will hopefully put us in good stead in a changing climate as well. So I will say we've gotten quite a few questions that I think will, not to pass the buck, but will be answered in the future parts of this displacement webinar series. So we will take these questions and make sure to bring them to the other webinars, and maybe we can even try and pull together a little Q&A as part of the resource page for people in case you're not able to make those future webinars. But I will say, especially the one on October 22nd, we'll talk specifically about strategic retreat and answer some of the questions about Native communities, loss of culture that some of you are asking in here. I did want to start, a couple of the presentations today. We talked about, our focus was really about how to improve our abilities to stay in place. So there's a reason that we were kind of focusing on some of those stay in place interventions. So we do have a question, though, that some of those interventions can actually lead to green gentrification. So Do our panelists have any recommendations on how we can prevent lower income and vulnerable populations from being pushed out of those resilient communities that they are part of building?
Well, yeah, that was definitely a big concern when we were working with the Department of Watershed Management on the EIB financing work that they were doing, a lot of green infrastructure projects, and that was going to be in a lot of historically disinvested communities. And so working with communities to ask what it was that they wanted, and also building community wealth while we were doing that, so that the majority of jobs around the green infrastructure projects were hyper-local. And that residents were the first to get the opportunity to work on those. And then I saw a question about community benefits agreements, and that's definitely something that we don't really have in place in Atlanta, but at least some sort of community benefits policy or agreement that can ensure that the legacy residents get to remain after those resilient strategies are put in place.
Nice.
Yeah, and maybe just building on that a little bit, Kirsten, I think one of the things that sometimes Karen Chappell has said is gentrification often follows displacement. And so I think the point you made earlier was really salient around anticipating displacement. And, there are these tools like community benefits agreements that, sort of really address when an outside developer comes in, which is a really important tool to really get, local hiring and affordable housing and things like this. And also even, what can happen even before that, to some of your examples that you highlighted, that's really solving for some of the underlying issues versus, thinking about that as it's happening. And so in some of these places that are maybe like seen as slower growing, or maybe not at the cusp of gentrification, how are we getting ahead of that? I think is really important.
Do you have any recommendations for helping communities understand the need for immediate attention on climate change?
By all means, if other folks want to jump in, go for it. But I guess where we live and work, that's no longer the main need. People understand it, people get it. We're all like hiding from the smoke and the fires. But it has been a big need over a long time. I think one of the things that we found is sometimes not even leading with climate change, but leading with like the work that we were doing with folks in East Palo Alto. Their big concern was actually not necessarily like sea level rise. It was water quality, which has been bad for decades, where they've had virtually no control over their local water and the quality of it. And that's going to get a lot worse as saltwater intrusion happens. And so by starting from the like, what are the big issues that you're really having and facing in your community? And then figuring out how those are part of the broader changes that are happening alongside climate change. That was something that was really successful for us in being able to make the case and being able to link things to climate change.
We had quite a few questions about when does displacement become mass migration, and I think one of the things that was important to keep in mind that even the definition of refugee does not consider climate change. It is, I think, religious persecution, political persecution. So climate change hasn't even been factored into the legal framework and vernacular. So I think that limits some of the international and federal designations that some people are asking about as far as policy implications. But we do have a question as far as receiving communities, so say Atlanta and Georgia, who may be getting some folks from Florida as they're escaping sea level rise. Are you thinking about displacement caused by incoming displaced residents from other areas and those who may be taking in people that are flush with cash from FEMA and other assistance programs that may have an unfair advantage in a tight housing market.
Yeah, I don't know that Atlanta kind of distinguishes that sort of influx, but I think that Atlanta just has recognized that there's going to be a lot of population growth in the coming years, and so just in general, recognizing that for the most part we have been building a city for wealthier people, and we continue to push legacy residents out of their homes, and so that's another really good point that the city needs to be discussing. And so yes, that's something that we work with all the time in our resident leader academies. As we'll discuss, there's a lot of expertise in these communities, and so we do provide a stipend for residents when they take part in our programs, and we help to equip them with the tools to advocate for what they need. And so yes, that's absolutely an issue alongside the other causes of a rising population in our city.
Maybe just one point to add is that, I think some of the places that we're working in with Spark are thinking about the idea of joint development. And so, I think there's the equitable transit-oriented development, ensuring that housing and transit and other amenities are, created together. And even I think, Catherine, you mentioned Measure A in Los Angeles, in thinking about ensuring that parks investments are happening hand in hand with affordable housing, and ensuring that those investments that are bringing these climate benefits are tied to the people that are the legacy folks that are living there and are not driving the cost up.
Mm-hmm. So I do want to be mindful of time. Molly, do you want to give a pitch for the next in the series?
Yeah, sure. I was going to see if you had one more question, but I think I agree.
Yeah.
It was very interesting listening to you all. Thank you to our presenters for sharing some really valuable information today, and even your personal stories as well. So really appreciate that. And thanks to everyone who attended. Here on this slide, you can see the next sessions for the upcoming parts of the Climate Displacement Forum that we have left. And we'll be sending out a recording of this presentation to you early next week. So feel free to point any colleagues who missed out to the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange, where it will be posted. And just a note, in addition to our webinar recording, CAKE is home to hundreds of adaptation resources, including case studies and resources related to today's presentation, some of which you have links to already. So finally, after today's session, we just wanted to invite you all to virtual discussions via our online network. So you can join any of your preferred networks that are on this slide. And we'll, throughout this next few weeks of the Climate Displacement Forum, we'll be posting discussion questions and engaging questions to keep the conversations going. So once again, thank you to all the presenters. And we, on behalf of EcoAdapt, I just want to say, hope you have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Everybody.
Thanks. Bye.